The morning sun cast long shadows across the prison gates as James took his first steps into freedom. The weight of 5 years behind bars seemed to lift slightly with each step, but the memories still clung to him like a heavy coat he couldn't shed. At 35, his face showed the weathered lines of someone who'd seen too much, yet his eyes held a determination that prison walls couldn't dim. The small bag of belongings in his hand contained everything he owned, a few worn photographs, some paperwork, and the clothes he'd worn the day they took him in. He couldn't help but smile at the irony of how those clothes now hung loose on his frame, a reminder of how much had changed. His brother waited in an old pickup truck, engine running, radio playing softly in the background. Their embrace was long and tight, speaking volumes that words couldn't express. "You ready to head home?" his brother asked, voice thick with emotion. James nodded, not trusting himself to speak just yet. As they drove through familiar streets that somehow looked different now, James's mind wandered back to that night. He'd been closing up his small corner store, just like any other evening, when Officer Wilson had shown up. The memory of what followed still made his jaw clench. The baseless accusations, the planted evidence, the casual cruelty wrapped in a badge and uniform. The trial had been a blur of prejudice masked as procedure. Despite having security camera footage showing he was locking up when the robbery happened across town, somehow Officer Wilson's testimony had carried more weight. It took 5 years and a dedicated legal team to finally uncover the truth, the officer's history of targeting black business owners, the pattern of false reports, the web of lies that had sent an innocent man to prison. The car passed by his old store, now a discount phone repair shop. His brother must have noticed him staring because he squeezed James's shoulder. "Hey, you remember that empty garage on Pine Street? The one next to Mom's old hair salon. It's for rent. Just saying." His brother's words carried hope, and James felt something stir inside him, the first flickers of a plan taking shape. They pulled up to his brother's house, where his mother waited on the porch. The sight of her nearly broke him. She'd aged more than 5 years should allow, but her smile was as bright as ever. As she wrapped him in her arms, the scent of her perfume, the same one she'd worn his entire life, brought tears to his eyes. "I made your favorite," she whispered, leading him inside where the smell of home-cooked food filled the air. The kitchen table was set for 3, just like old times, except everything felt different now. Better somehow, despite everything. Or maybe because of everything. Later that evening, as James sat on the porch watching the sunset, his mother joined in with 2 cups of coffee. "What's on your mind, baby?" she asked, though they both knew she could read him like a book. "I want to do something that matters," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "All that time inside, I kept thinking about how things could be different. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been wronged by people who are supposed to protect us." His mother nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Then that's what you'll do. One step at a time." She paused, sipping her coffee. "You know, your father always said the best revenge is living well and helping others do the same." As night fell over the neighborhood, James felt the first real sense of peace he'd had in years. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Finding work with a record wouldn't be easy, even if it had been overturned. People would still look at him differently, and Officer Wilson was still out there wearing his badge like armor. But tonight, surrounded by the love of his family and armed with a purpose bigger than himself, James knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about transformation, his own and maybe, if he worked hard enough, his community's too. He pulled out a small notebook and began to write, planning his next steps. The garage on Pine Street could be something more than just another auto shop. It could be a beginning. And maybe, just maybe, it could help write a different ending to stories like his. 6 months could change everything, and James was living proof of that. The old garage on Pine Street had transformed from a rusty shell into something special. The sign above the door read, "Second Chance Auto Repair," and most days you could hear the mixed sounds of tools clanking and laughter floating through the open bay doors. Getting started hadn't been easy. Banks aren't exactly eager to loan money to someone fresh out of prison, no matter how wrong that conviction was. But his community had stepped up in ways that still humbled him. Mrs. Thompson from the church donated her late husband's tools. The kids from the neighborhood helped paint the walls. His brother's construction crew spent weekends helping him fix the roof. The real turning point came when old Mr. Washington brought in his prized 1965 Mustang. The car had been sitting in his garage for 15 years, and nobody had been able to get it running. James spent 2 weeks working on it, staying late into the night, treating the classic car like it was made of gold. When that engine finally purred to life, Mr. Washington's face lit up like a child on Christmas morning. Word spread fast after that. Now, most afternoons, you'd find more than just cars being fixed at Second Chance. Local kids would drop by after school, curious about engines and life in general. James started teaching them basic car maintenance, but it grew into something more. They'd talk about their dreams, their struggles, their fears. He'd listen, share his own story, help them see different paths forward. "You see this engine?" he'd tell them, pointing to the complex machinery. "Life's a lot like this. Looks complicated at first, but once you understand how all the parts work together, you can fix almost anything. Same goes for your life. You just need the right tools and someone to show you how to use them." 3 times a week, James would host evening meetings in the garage's small office. People who'd been through the system would gather, sharing coffee and stories. Some were angry, some were broken, but all of them found something valuable in that room: hope, understanding, a chance to be seen as more than their past mistakes. The local paper did a small story about the garage and its owner. They focused on the technical skills being taught to young people, but readers could see the deeper story between the lines. Letters started coming in from other former inmates, asking for advice on starting over. James answered every single one. Not everyone was happy about his success, of course. Some people still crossed the street when they saw him coming. Officer Wilson and his friends would drive by slowly, sometimes watching. But James kept his head high and his doors open. The security cameras he installed caught everything anyway. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. One day, a young man came in, hands shaking, eyes darting around nervously. He'd just gotten out after 3 years and didn't know where to turn. James recognized that lost look. He'd seen it in his own mirror not so long ago. He hired the guy on the spot as an apprentice. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said, handing him a work shirt. "Sometimes they just need someone to give it to them." The work was steady now, enough to hire 2 full-time mechanics. Both had records, both were excelling. Customers came from all over town, drawn by the quality work and fair prices. But it was the atmosphere that kept them coming back, the sense that this wasn't just a repair shop, but a place where broken things and broken people could find new life. Every evening, before locking up, James would walk through the garage, straightening tools, checking equipment. These quiet moments were when he felt most grateful. The smell of oil and metal reminded him of his father's garage from childhood. "Always leave things better than you found them," his dad used to say. James was trying to live up to that, one day at a time. Looking out at the street through the open bay doors, he'd sometimes catch glimpses of his old life, the fear, the anger, the sense of helplessness. But those feelings didn't have power over him anymore. He had built something here, something that mattered. Not just a business, but a beacon of hope for others who needed it. As he turned the key in the lock each night, James would smile, knowing tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help, new chances to prove that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's showing the world a better way forward. Rain pounded against the windshield as James drove home from the garage that evening. The weather report had warned about storms, but nobody expected anything this severe. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the road ahead in brief, bright bursts. He was about to turn onto Oak Street when he saw it, the crumpled metal of 2 cars tangled together at the intersection. His headlights caught the steam rising from a damaged radiator, and without thinking twice, he pulled over. The rain was coming down in sheets now, but he could make out people moving around the accident scene. As he got closer, his heart stopped for a second. There, in the glow of emergency lights, stood Officer Wilson, looking worse for wear than James remembered. The years hadn't been kind to Wilson. His uniform hung loose on his frame, and even through the rain, James could smell the faint trace of alcohol. A young mother sat in her car, clutching her child in the backseat, both looking scared but unhurt. The other driver, an elderly man, was standing under an umbrella held by another officer, giving his statement. "Get back!" Wilson shouted when he spotted James approaching. "This is a police matter." His words slurred slightly, his face twisted with the same ugly prejudice James remembered from 5 years ago. But something was different now. Wilson's hands were shaking, and his eyes couldn't quite focus. James pulled out his phone and started recording, keeping his distance but making sure to capture everything. "Just trying to help," he said calmly, loud enough to be heard over the rain. "I'm a certified mechanic. That car's smoking pretty bad. Might want to check the engine before it catches fire." The other officer looked between them, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. The young mother watched from her car, her child pressing his face against the window. Wilson took a step forward, his boots splashing in the growing puddles. "I said get back." Wilson's voice cracked this time. "We don't need your kind here." The words hung in the air, heavy with hatred, but they didn't have the power they once did. Other cars were stopping now, people watching from under their umbrellas, some recording with their phones. James kept his voice steady, his hands visible. "Ma'am," he called to the mother, "your radiator's damaged. In this rain, the hot engine could crack if it's not handled properly. I own Second Chance Auto Repair down on Pine. I can help if you'll let me." The mother nodded, clearly more afraid of the increasingly agitated officer than the calm man offering assistance. The other officer stepped forward, placing a hand on Wilson's shoulder. "Let him check it out," he said quietly. "He's right about the radiator." That's when it happened. Wilson turned, really looked at James for the first time, and recognition dawned in his bloodshot eyes. 5 years of guilt, shame, and denial crashed across his face all at once. His hand went to his belt, not for his weapon, but as if searching for support to keep standing. James moved carefully toward the smoking car, every step deliberate. He popped the hood, the heat from the engine mixing with the cold rain to create clouds of steam. As he worked, he could hear Wilson behind him, breathing heavily, muttering under his breath. The crowd had grown larger, despite the rain. Phones recorded everything: Wilson's racial slurs, James's calm professionalism, the stark contrast between past and present playing out in the storm. Some recognized James from the newspaper article, others knew him from his work in the community. They watched as he helped the mother and her child into a safe spot as he secured her car to prevent further damage. The other officer had called for backup, reading the situation better than Wilson could in his state. James could hear sirens in the distance, drawing closer. He finished what he needed to do with the car, wrote down his garage's information for the mother, and started to step away. That's when Wilson finally broke. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words almost lost in a crack of thunder. "I'm so sorry." He wasn't talking about the accident, and everyone knew it. James paused, rain running down his face, and looked at the man who'd stolen 5 years of his life. The moment stretched between them, filled with the sound of rain and distant thunder. James could taste the bitter words he'd held back for years, feel the weight of everything this man had taken from him. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and steady. "Prove it," he said simply, "not to me, to them." He gestured at the watching crowd, at the community they both served in such different ways. "Show them what change looks like." Then he turned and walked back to his car, leaving Wilson standing in the rain, surrounded by the cameras that would soon tell this story to the world. The video spread like wildfire across social media. By morning, James's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. Local news vans parked outside his garage, reporters hoping to catch him for a comment. His brother called, worried about the attention. His mother left 3 voicemails, each more concerned than the last. But James didn't answer any of them. Instead, he opened the garage like any other morning, got his tools ready, and started working on Mrs. Chen's old Honda that needed a new timing belt. The regular sounds of wrenches and metal helped him think clearly about what had happened last night. The young apprentice he hired watched him from the corner, finally gathering courage to speak. "I saw the video," he said quietly. "Man, you could have taken him down right there. Everyone would have understood. Why didn't you?" James wiped his hands on a shop rag, thinking carefully about his answer. "Because taking someone down isn't the same as lifting yourself up," he said. 5 years inside taught me that much." More people filtered into the garage throughout the morning. Some brought coffee, others just wanted to show support. A few came with their own stories about Officer Wilson, similar encounters, different endings. Each story added weight to the decision James knew he had to make. Around noon, his phone rang again. This time it was the police chief's office. They wanted to meet, discuss the incident, hear his side of the story. The chief's secretary sounded nervous, probably expecting him to bring lawyers and demands. Instead, James asked for one simple thing. He wanted Officer Wilson to be there. Before heading to the meeting, he sat in his office watching the video again. The rain had made everything look dramatic, like a scene from a movie. But it was the small details that caught his attention now. Wilson's shaking hands, the fear in his eyes when he recognized James, the way his voice broke when he apologized. The police station looked exactly the same as it had 5 years ago. Same faded brick, same squeaky front door. But this time, James walked in through the front entrance, head held high. The desk sergeant recognized him from the video and quickly called upstairs. In the chief's office, Wilson sat slumped in a chair, looking like he hadn't slept. 2 other officers stood near the wall, and the chief sat behind his desk, face grave. Everyone tensed when James walked in, expecting the worst. "Before we start," James said, pulling out his phone, "I want to show you something." He pulled up photos from his garage. Kids learning about engines, former inmates working honest jobs, community meetings where people from all walks of life came together. "This is what second chances look like," he said. The room was silent as he swiped through the pictures. 5 years ago, Officer Wilson made a choice based on fear and prejudice. Yesterday, I made a different choice. Now you all have a choice to make. He turned to Wilson directly. "You can keep carrying that hate, let it eat you up inside until there's nothing left. Or you can do something about it. Help fix what's broken, not just in the system, but in yourself." The chief leaned forward. "What exactly are you asking for?" James laid out his proposal. No lawsuit, no demands for Wilson's badge. Instead, he wanted the department to work with his community center, creating real dialogue between police and the people they served. He wanted Wilson to get help for his drinking, to speak at police training sessions about his mistakes and what they cost. "Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself," James said, looking at Wilson. "But that's where healing has to start." Wilson looked up, tears in his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "After everything I did to you?" James thought about his father's words about leaving things better than you found them. He thought about the kids in his garage, learning that there's always another way. He thought about his mother's prayers for peace in their community. "Because change has to start somewhere," he said simply, "and revenge, that just keeps the cycle going. I'm choosing to break it." The chief sat back, studying James carefully. "You're a better man than most," he said finally. James shook his head. "No, I just had time to learn what matters. Now it's your turn to show what you've learned." As he left the station that afternoon, camera crews tried to swarm him. They wanted to know if he was pressing charges, if he was suing, if he wanted Wilson fired. James just smiled and pointed to his garage down the street. "Come by sometime," he told them. "See what we're building. That's the real story here." Walking back to his garage, James felt lighter than he had in years. Sometimes the biggest choices aren't about what you do to others, but what you refuse to let others turn you into. The rain had washed away yesterday's storm, leaving the air clean and fresh. It felt like a new beginning. 2 weeks after the rainy night encounter, James was under the hood of a customer's truck when he heard familiar footsteps entering his garage. Looking up, he saw Officer Wilson standing there, out of uniform, holding a paper cup of coffee that trembled slightly in his hand. The garage went quiet. The young apprentice stopped mid-wrench turn, and Mrs. Chen, waiting for her car's oil change, clutched her purse tighter. But James just wiped his hands on his work cloth and gestured to his small office. 30 days sober, Wilson said as soon as the office door closed behind them. His voice was clearer now, his eyes sharper. "The department's counselor says I should make amends. But that doesn't seem like enough, not after what I did." James sat back in his creaky office chair, studying the man who'd once seemed so powerful, so untouchable. Now he just looked tired, human. "You're right," James said. "It's not enough. But it's a start." Wilson pulled out a folder from his jacket. "I've been going through my old cases." "There were others." His voice trailed off. "I'm turning everything over to internal affairs. Some of my colleagues aren't happy about it. But I keep thinking about that night, how you helped those people while I just He shook his head. Outside the office window, James could see his apprentice teaching a group of neighborhood kids about spark plugs. One boy kept asking questions, his eyes bright with curiosity. A year ago, that same kid was getting into trouble, heading down a dangerous path. "See that kid out there?" James pointed. "When he first came here, he was angry at the world. Thought everyone was against him. Sound familiar?" Wilson nodded slowly. "But someone gave him a chance to be more than his worst moments. That's all any of us need sometimes." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. A news crew had shown up again, cameras ready. They'd been trying to turn the story into something sensational, but they kept missing the real transformation happening quietly in places like this garage. "They want me to do an interview," Wilson said, watching the reporters through the window. "Tell my side of the story. But I don't deserve a platform, not after what I did to you and others." James thought for a moment. Maybe it's not about deserving. Maybe it's about what you do with it. Those kids out there, they need to see that people can change. Even people with badges, especially people with badges. Wilson's hands had stopped shaking. He looked around the office, taking in the certificates on the wall, automotive certifications mixed with community service awards. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you let go of the anger?" "Who says I have?" James replied honestly. "I still get angry, but I choose what to do with that anger. Turn it into something useful, like teaching kids there's always another way, or showing cops that the people they're supposed to protect are just that, people." A knock on the door interrupted them. The apprentice poked his head in. "Boss, Mrs. Chen's car is ready, and we've got that community meeting in an hour." James stood up. "Actually, why don't you stay for the meeting?" he said to Wilson. "It's a support group for folks transitioning back into the community. Might be good for everyone to hear your perspective, if you're willing to listen to theirs." Wilson hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that, if they'll have me." As they walked out of the office, the news crew spotted them. Cameras started rolling, reporters shouting questions, but what they captured wasn't the sensational confrontation they'd hoped for. Instead, they saw two men, once divided by hatred and fear, walking side by side towards something new. The afternoon sun streamed through the garage windows, catching the dust motes in its beams. Tools clinked against metal, voices murmured in conversation, and somewhere in the background, a radio played softly. Just another day at Second Chance Auto Repair, where broken things and people came to be made whole again. The meeting would start soon. People would share their stories, their struggles, their hopes, and maybe, just maybe, they'd all learn something about what it truly means to change. Because sometimes the biggest turning points don't come with dramatic speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes they come in quiet moments, in small choices, in the simple decision to see each other as human beings worthy of a second chance. The community center's meeting room was packed. People lined the walls, some sitting cross-legged on the floor. The local news had gotten wind of what was happening here, but James had asked them to leave their cameras outside. Some things needed to happen away from the spotlight. Officer Wilson sat in the back row, wearing civilian clothes, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Next to him, his counselor from the recovery program offered quiet support. The past month had been rough, going through withdrawal, facing his demons, dealing with the backlash from some fellow officers who saw his confession to internal affairs as betrayal. James stood at the front of the room, looking out at the faces before him. Shop owners who'd suffered similar harassment, young people who'd been wrongly targeted, officers who wanted to be part of the solution. They'd all come together because they believed change was possible. "Most of you know my story," James began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. 5 years taken from me because one man let his prejudice override his duty. But today isn't about that story, it's about writing a new one. He pulled out the proposal they'd worked on for weeks. Community leaders, reform-minded officers, legal experts, they'd all contributed. "The department has agreed to implement new training programs," he explained. "But not the usual kind where someone lectures from a manual. Real training, with real people sharing real experiences." A hand went up in the middle of the room. "How do we know they're serious?" The question came from a local baker who'd had his own run-ins with biased policing. "How do we know this isn't just for show?" James nodded at Wilson, who slowly stood up. The room tensed. Some people recognized him from the viral video. Others knew him from personal experience. He cleared his throat, obviously nervous, but his voice grew stronger as he spoke. "Because I'm the proof," Wilson said. "I was the worst kind of officer, one who thought the badge made me right, no matter what. Who saw threats instead of people. Who let alcohol and anger poison everything I touched." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But standing here today, I see something different. I see the damage I caused, and I see a chance to help fix it." The room was silent. James watched as people processed Wilson's words. He saw the moment when understanding began to dawn. This wasn't just about one officer's redemption or one man's forgiveness. This was about breaking cycles that had trapped their community for generations. "The department isn't just implementing new training," James continued. "They're creating a civilian oversight board with real power. They're reviewing past cases where bias might have played a role. And most importantly, they're listening to us, really listening." He laid out the rest of the plan: monthly meetings between officers and community members, a mentorship program pairing at-risk youth with reformed officers, new guidelines for handling complaints. Each point had been carefully crafted to create real change, not just the appearance of it. A young officer in the front row raised her hand. "I want to help," she said. "But some of my colleagues, they're resistant. They think admitting mistakes makes us look weak." Wilson spoke up again. "I used to think that way. But you know what's really weak? Hiding behind a badge instead of facing the truth. Real strength is what I saw that rainy night. A man who had every right to hate me, choosing to help instead." The discussion continued for hours. People shared stories, voiced concerns, offered solutions. Some cried as they spoke about past hurts. Others expressed hope for the future. Through it all, James watched the subtle shifts happening in the room, barriers breaking down, understanding growing, healing beginning. Near the end, an elderly woman who'd been quiet all evening stood up. "My grandson," she said, her voice shaking, "he's in prison right now. Because an officer planted evidence, just like they did to you." She looked directly at Wilson. "Can you help him?" Wilson met her gaze steadily. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll testify about everything I know. Every case where I or others crossed the line. It won't be easy, but it's right." As the meeting wound down, people lingered, talking in small groups. James watched as Wilson exchanged contact information with the elderly woman, promising to meet with her grandson's lawyer. He saw officers and community members making plans for future discussions. Outside, the evening air was cool and fresh. News crews were packing up their equipment, disappointed they hadn't gotten any dramatic footage. But James knew the real story wouldn't have shown up on camera anyway. Real change happens in small moments, in quiet conversations, in the gradual building of trust. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Wilson asked as they locked up the community center. James nodded, looking up at the stars. "Justice isn't just about punishment," he said. "Sometimes it's about transformation, about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." They walked to their cars in comfortable silence, two men who'd once been enemies, now working together to heal their community. The true meaning of justice, James thought, wasn't found in revenge or retribution. It was found in the courage to change, the wisdom to forgive, and the strength to build something better from the ashes of the past. 1 year could change everything. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly opened Community Center for Change, catching the fresh paint on the walls. James stood in the entrance, taking it all in. The building that had once been an abandoned warehouse now hummed with life and purpose. Inside the main hall, people were setting up for today's graduation ceremony. 30 officers would complete their new community engagement training program. But these weren't just any officers. They were the ones who'd volunteered to be part of the first wave of change, including some who'd initially been Wilson's strongest critics. Wilson himself was already there, helping arrange shares. He looked different now, clear-eyed, steady, at peace with himself. His testimony had helped free 3 wrongfully convicted people so far, and he'd become one of the program's most effective speakers, sharing his story with police departments across the state. "Never thought I'd see this day," said James's brother, walking in with a box of certificates. "Remember when this place was just an idea we talked about on your first night home?" James smiled, remembering those early conversations on the porch. Back then, it had seemed impossible, a dream too big to reach. But here they were, 1 year later, watching that dream take shape in ways he never imagined. The center had become more than just a meeting place. One room housed a legal clinic where volunteer lawyers helped review cases of possible wrongful convictions. Another served as a youth mentorship space where kids learned everything from auto repair to computer coding. The main hall hosted community dialogues, support groups, and now training programs. People started arriving for the ceremony. Family members of those who'd been wrongfully convicted sat next to police officers' families. Kids from the mentorship program helped guide people to their seats. The local baker who'd once questioned whether change was possible now supplied all the center's events with fresh pastries. "Got a minute?" Wilson called from the side room. James found him standing near a wall of photos, a timeline of the past year. There they were at the first community meeting, both looking tense and uncertain. Then at the garage, surrounded by young apprentices. The day they testified together at the state capitol about police reform. Each image told part of their story. "My daughter's talking to me again," Wilson said quietly. "First time in 3 years. Says she's proud of what I'm doing here." His eyes were damp, but his smile was genuine. "Never thought making things right would give me back so much." The ceremony was about to begin when an unexpected guest arrived, the police chief from the neighboring city. He'd heard about their program and wanted to see it for himself. James watched as Wilson greeted him, naturally falling into the role of guide and educator. As people took their seats, James stepped up to the podium. Looking out at the crowd, he saw the whole spectrum of his community, different races, backgrounds, and beliefs, all coming together. The young apprentice from his garage sat near the front, now a certified mechanic himself. The elderly woman whose grandson had been freed thanks to Wilson's testimony beamed from her seat. "A year ago," James began, "I stood in the rain at a car accident, face to face with the man who'd taken 5 years of my life. I had a choice to make that night. But what I didn't know was that choice would lead us here, to something bigger than any of us imagined." He gestured to the graduates. "These officers didn't just sit through some lectures. They spent time in our community. They learned our stories. They shared their own. They chose to be part of the change we needed to see." The ceremony proceeded with each graduate receiving their certificate. But more importantly, each one stood up and shared a story of transformation, a moment when their perspective has shifted, when they'd seen beyond their badges to the human beings they served. Later, as people mingled over coffee and the baker's pastries, James overheard snippets of conversation that made his heart full. Officers planning community events, kids talking about becoming lawyers, former inmates sharing success stories. The walls that had once divided them were slowly coming down. "You know what the best part is," his mother said, appearing at his side. "This isn't just about our town anymore. People are watching, learning, wanting to do the same thing in their own communities." She was right. They'd already received calls from 3 other cities wanting to implement similar programs. The state legislature was looking at their training model as a potential standard. What had started as one man's choice not to seek revenge had grown into something that could change lives across the country. As the sun set on their celebration, James stood outside the center, watching people leave in groups, officers and civilians walking together, talking and laughing like old friends. A young boy ran past, wearing a toy police badge along with a Second Chance Auto Repair t-shirt. "Ready to head home?" his brother asked, locking up behind them. James took one last look at the building, at the sign that read Community Center for Change in bold letters. "Yeah," he said, smiling. "But you know what? This is just the beginning." And he was right. Because true change isn't about one moment, one choice, or one person. It's about the ripples that spread from that moment, touching lives in ways we might never see. It's about proving that even in the darkest times, light can break through. All it takes is one person brave enough to choose a different path, and others courageous enough to follow.